For Crema Media's Polity, I'm Sane Dhlamini. Researcher and analyst Professor Raymond Suttner joins me to discuss xenophobic discourse and disease. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you.
Do you think it's fair to blame the influx of immigrants to the country if we look at the statement that was issued by our Health Minister Aaron Motsoaledi and the former Gauteng MEC Qedani Mahlangu as well?
I think it's a very serious problem when people don't tackle the problems for which they are partly to blame themselves, and instead they blame people from Somalia or from other parts of Mozambique, Tanzania, and Zimbabwe, or they blame Indians and all these sorts of things. It is very serious because what you're doing is you're helping to create enmity between communities, divisiveness. And instead of assisting to build a situation where people are integrated into society, you're actually trying to create suspicion around them. Because my sense is that the suspicion is not only of people who are illegally in the country, they're actually antagonistic to foreign people in general. Mashaba is obviously. And that is not what we fought for in the struggle in South Africa. We fought for a South Africa that belongs to all who live in it. So I think this is very dangerous. It's also more dangerous when they associate foreign people as bearers of disease. That is really racist. And in the history of South Africa, Africans were moved out of areas, Indians were moved out because they said there's going to be a spread of this disease and that disease. It's really shameful that the ANC is doing this.
But then you also say that Motsoaledi is in line with the sentiment of those who instigate attacks in some sections of the public who do not place value on the lives of all human beings, or in the case of the small traders. What do you mean by that?
Well, I'm not saying he's exactly the same as these people who threaten traders and all of that, but all of it is part of a sentiment which doesn't recognize the full humanity of all human beings. And freedom is a universal notion. In other words, it is not freedom for you and I and not for that people. If you have freedom, you must have freedom for everyone. And that is the problem with what Motsoaledi is doing. He's saying foreigners are filling up our beds, the beds South Africans can't get there. And when you look at what's happened, the website that I cited, there's a lot of things that have got nothing to do with foreigners that have caused dysfunctionality in the health system.
You also, in your column, states that the truth of the matter, if we look at the health system, is not that there is people with illegal papers or we have legal people in the country, but you just zoom at the crisis in the health system. What do you think should be done to make sure that the officials, they look at the problem for what it is, but not blame the immigrants?
Well, you know, that's a question of performance management. Like, it's not something that I can deal with. If, for example, you shuffle a cabinet and you keep in people who are not performing, well, then you're not going to remedy the question. People must understand that if they don't do their job, there will be consequences. And in the case of officials, they have performance agreements, things like this, and that should be adhered to. And in the case of the health system, I'm not a specialist, so I can't say precisely what is required in every health institution, but clearly there are things that can be done besides blaming foreigners.
Much of what is happening in our country, in mostly government departments, the looting and corruption, has also been partly blamed with the associated with the Zuma years. You are also stating in your column that the period of looting and corruption has depleted resources, including those allocated for healthcare. But then you also mentioned the issue of cowardice that persists. What more can you say on that? Is it still fair to refer to what happened in the Zuma administration as we are moving forward?
Well, what I'm saying is that people had a sense that they are not prepared to come to the side of the vulnerable, and instead they will batter them even more. That to me is cowardice, and this attack on foreigners is very similar to that. But it's not just cowardice, it's also callousness, a fact that you don't care about the fate of these very vulnerable human beings.
You are also touching on what was mentioned by one of the ANC leaders, Pixlika Isakaseme, where he called for an end to tribal enmity and division. What can be learned from what he said, taking from what the Freedom Charter is also stressing?
Well, the idea for the formation of the ANC was to unite the African people who had been divided. Some of them fought on the side of the colonial conquerors, and that way it was easier to conquer the African people. Now, the ANC later built alliances with other population groups, and that sense of unity expanded over time. And building that unity, building good relationships within the African people, but also between different communities, African and non-African, is what we can learn.
And if you also look at what you also mentioned when you looked at how Adolf Hitler spoke about the Germans then.
The Jews.
The Jews. What do you think has been done by the leaders to shift the blame instead of looking at the real issues?
Well, I don't think they have Hitler in their mind. But what I'm saying is this sort of connection of disease with a vulnerable group is what Hitler did with the Jews in Germany. He associated them with a whole lot of things that caused people misfortune, including disease. So what I'm saying is it's very, very dangerous, this talk of Ebola carriers in the case of Mashaba, or just say overcrowding is leading to disease and the overcrowding being caused by foreigners. That is dangerous.
Thank you, Raymond.
Thank you.
That was political analyst Professor Raymond Suttner speaking to Crema Media's Polity about xenophobic discourse and disease.